Well, thank you for turning out, despite the Warriors being involved in some sort of contest, I understand. My name is TJ Stiles, and I am here to be the interlocutor with Scott Turow for Scott Turow, Master of the Legal Thriller. And this is... that punctuates my point, which is it's a great honor for me to do this because Scott is not only a fantastic author, but also a great advocate for authors as a past president of the Authors Guild. This event is being sponsored by the Authors Guild, which is the nation's oldest authors advocacy and membership organization. And thank you very much. Yes. And since this is a very appropriate both book as well as author to have at the festival this year, Scott's new book, which is what we're going to start off talking about, is Testimony, which is fantastic. It is just a terrific book. And as so often with his work, it takes very important and interesting subject matter and weaves a completely compelling plot and believable real characters, and is completely engrossing and a real pleasure to read, as well as touches on important subjects. So we're going to be talking about that, Scott's career, and then we're also going to be talking about the Authors Guild and just the issues facing authors today, and give plenty of time to that, as well as time for your questions. And so please, one more round of applause, please, for Scott Turow. I'm going to put this up on display here, so at least
I do have to interrupt just to say that it's relatively rare to be able to sit down in conversation with someone who has won the Pulitzer Prize once, but let alone twice. And then he says, and then TJ says, he's honored. So I'm enormously flattered that TJ and I know each other from the Authors Guild, and we've been shoulder to shoulder for a long time. But it's still a great kindness on his part.
Yeah, I've been on the Authors Guild board for a few years, and have been just really impressed by just getting to know you. It's really been terrific. And again, we have to remember that Scott is, and we're going to start off by talking about his path into writing and the law. He's the author of, now correct me if I'm wrong, Scott, 11 novels, 2, I'm not counting books that he's edited or contributed to, 11 novels and 2 nonfiction works, I believe. One of his most, is that correct? One of his most beloved nonfiction works, which is still in print and still beloved by lawyers, is 1L, a memoir. This is, you can tell he needs no introduction. A memoir of his first year in law school. And of course, his first great hit as a novelist in his first novel, Presumed Innocent, which came out in 1987. Now, I was a graduate student. He wrote that book when he was 12, and I was a 5-year-old. I was a 5-year-old graduate student when it came out, and stuck reading nothing but scholarly monographs. And it was literally the first novel I picked up when I could finally start reading things I liked to read. And it was just so terrific, and immediately made me a fan. So what I'd like to do is, everybody here is a fan or interested in your work. And so I want to talk about this new book, Testimony, and he's on tour to flog this book, and we're going to flog the hell out of this bastard. But we're also going to, use that to talk about your process and about how you see your role as a lawyer and an author. And what I think people may not realize is that you're not some lawyer who got it into your head one day that, geez, maybe I could write a novel. You actually started off studying creative writing. Is that right?
Right. I went to college at Amherst College in Massachusetts, and I had fallen in love with Amherst, standing on the War Memorial there and looking out at the blue Pelham Hills and I was determined to become a novelist there, and you can tell the kind of 17-year-old I was by the fact that as soon as I got there in the fall of 1966 to enroll in classes, I only then discovered that there were no creative writing courses taught at Amherst College, which it actually was it proved to be a good thing because, with nobody to sort of give me direct instruction, I sat down after my freshman year and made my first attempt to write a novel. And I actually, of course, had hit upon the only real formula that ever works, which is, just do it. But when I finished at Amherst, I ended up at another esteemed Bay Area university, a little further to the south and on the other side.
Yeah, the junior
university,
sibling
right?
University,
Right,
Stanford.
Right. So, and I was a writing fellow there for a couple of years, and then taught creative writing there, and was obviously. I mean, I think I'd announced when I was 10 years old that I wanted to be a novelist, and certainly from the time I went to college, I was really serious about it. So the decision to go to law school really took me by surprise. It was not to mention my poor father, who was a doctor, and as I always like to say, he was a doctor who hated lawyers long before it was common for doctors to do that.
He was a doctor in Chicago?
Yeah, he was an OB-GYN, and he just didn't understand the way lawyers went about their business and the way they were in the world. He was a very emotional guy, and he sort of did everything viscerally. And, the lawyers and their reasons and their elaborated reasons, to him it was all bullshit.
That's interesting. I always thought that doctors like to read legal thrillers and lawyers like to read medical thrillers.
Yeah, well, I have to tell a quick story as long as I mentioned my dad. I don't know how much of anything that I wrote my father actually read, but he did read Presumed Innocent after it came out, and he finally said to me, "All right, I finished that novel." And I said, "So, Dad, what did you think?" And he looked at me and he said, "I'll tell you what I think. I still think you could have gone to medical school."
That reminds me of a friend of mine said to my mother after I won the second Pulitzer, "You must be very proud of your son." She said, "We're very proud of all our children." And then gave him a lecture on what all my siblings were up to. So that doesn't surprise me at all. So, I mean, was this a story of you going to law school where you just had a change of heart, or did you feel like, this isn't working out, or maybe I have to put writing aside, or, I mean, was that, because, often failure is a part of success. Yeah. And running up those dead.
Well, I certainly had the failure part. I had gotten that down. I was failing very well. I don't know how many unpublished novels I had written by the time I left Stanford. I think 4. And they weren't all serious efforts, but certainly the one I had written while I was at Stanford was a serious attempt. Was a hippie novel that I finished long after everybody in America was sick of hippies. And it's easy to say, well, I went to law school because I wasn't having a lot of success as a novelist. But the truth, of course, is, there's a great community of young writers around the writing program at Stanford. None of them were having great success as novelists. And it's just a way to paper over other things that are harder to talk about, which is I was finding writing harder and harder emotionally. I was just kind of trying to drag it out of myself. And I knew from my own experiences when I was writing well that, that wasn't the way to do it. That there's there's got to be true inspiration if you're going to, certainly in writing fiction. So I knew that wasn't going well. And I also had sort of blundered into an academic career. And I talk about this somewhat tenderly because I don't like to diss anybody who's an academic. But, I'd been through an unbelievably bloody fight at Stanford over an appointment in the English department, and the classic, of course, that academic disputes are so intense because there's so little at stake, and but it really gave me an insight into sort of what went along with teaching that just didn't seem appetizing to me. And so I knew that I didn't want to remain in the academy. I knew I was having a hard time writing. I knew I did not want to stop writing. And I really had sort of blundered onto the law. The novel, the hippie novel, was about a rent strike in Chicago. And the linchpin of the plot was something called the Implied Warranty of Habitability. Now, this may shock you, but the Implied Warranty of Habitability, it turns out, is not the stuff of bestsellerdom. And I had sort of lost my way because I thought the Implied Warranty of Habitability, which was a new doctrine that was coming into American law that said that a tenant, when he or she rents an apartment, has a right for that place to be fit to live in. That seems obvious, and yet for a couple of centuries, American law had indulged the fiction that when somebody rents an apartment, they are actually renting the right to live over the ground underneath. And therefore, the condition of the apartment was beside the point. And the way the law had finally gotten its head screwed on right and come to what seemed an eminently just conclusion was really interesting to me. And I thought it was fascinating that the law, here was an institution, unlike most, that was actually capable of reforming itself. And, and the actual doctrine itself was interesting to me the more I learned about it. And I really realized that I was fascinated with law, and that if I didn't go to law school, I would have enormous regrets. The problem, of course, was that my literary dream and ambitions really seemed to hang in the balance.
Well, this is so interesting because when we talk about nonfiction especially, but it's also true for fiction, that the importance of the subject matter and versus the literary craft is there's an interwoven symbiotic relationship between the two in many, many works. Certainly, obviously, I work in nonfiction, I work in American history especially, of issues that I think are of great moral importance, and yet I put a great deal of effort in my craft. And that's obviously true for you as well. And this has been true, I think, for a lot of great fiction. The Pulitzer winner last year was Viet Nguyen's novel, The Sympathizer, a novel about Vietnam by a Vietnamese refugee that was just great fiction too. And this comes up in your work again and again, the fact that you are really interested in these questions of justice and the law, and not just the law as a process and a setting, but also the essence of it, the right and wrong of it. And then turning that into a great compelling story as well. So let's focus that question specifically on testimony, because this is a departure for you in terms of setting. That you probably, this has never occurred to anyone, Scott has a connection to Chicago. And your fictional Kendall County, which has been so important to your work, you've left Kendall County behind for the most part in this novel. Right. And so I saw that you had mentioned this in an interview, the process by which you got to this. And people with ideas that you want to suggest to them will be very interested in this. Could you just talk about how you got into this setting? And why don't you explain a little bit what it is?
Well, I think one of the things that I was unaware of was that, I'd sort of developed over the years a kind of writer's bucket list that eventually I need to write about, X or Y. And I was in The Hague in the year 2000, and I was at a reception there in the American ambassador's house, and The Hague is one of the few places in the world where justice is a growth industry. There are 11 different court systems that are operating there, and most of the growth has been in the international criminal tribunals set up by the UN to punish the war crimes committed in specific times and places. And there were a lot of young lawyers who'd worked at one of these criminal tribunals. Most of them were working in the Yugoslav tribunal, and that was dealing with war crimes committed in the Balkans War. And I found myself in a circle of 5 or 6 people, and they were all going, you've got to write. You've got to write a book about this place. The cases are amazing, and the back channel stuff, and all the diplomatic crap that's going on in the background, and the interpersonal stuff, because it's a city of expats. Most people are there living temporarily, so personal relationships sometimes get a little torrid, and I was sitting there listening to all of this, and it is not unusual for people to come up to me and say, I've got this great thing you've got to write about. There's this just terrible injustice. You won't believe this case. You'll get into it. Almost always they're talking about their divorce. But in this case, I thought, wow, there really are a lot of great elements here. Everything, The Hague is an international city, and the kinds of cases that are prosecuted by these courts, and the diplomatic environment, and it just seemed like there was a lot going on there. So I held on to the idea, and about 4 years ago, I decided, okay, I am going to write about the International Criminal Court, which had actually come into being after my trip to The Hague in the year 2000. The UN had finally said, okay, it's pretty obvious war crimes are not going to stop happening, and we want to set up a permanent war crimes tribunal. That notion and those negotiations had been led, interestingly enough, initially by the United States of America.
Which refused to take part.
President Clinton signed the so-called Rome Statute, which is the ICC treaty, along with 138 other countries. And he did not send it to the Senate for confirmation, but it still seemed like it was on the agenda for eventual ratification until 9/11 happened. And at that point, the American military was always hostile to the ICC. And their argument was, we, the U.S., go all over the world protecting peace. We really go in a peaceful role, and we shouldn't have to send our soldiers overseas and worry about them being prosecuted for war crimes in front of a foreign court whose procedures are nothing like our own. And President Bush accepted that argument, announced that he was unsigning the ICC treaty, and the U.S. was renouncing its obligations. And we then began an aggressive campaign of discouraging other countries from cooperating with the ICC. the Iraqis, for example, once Saddam was overthrown, wanted to sign the ICC treaty. They did, and then the Americans stepped in and said, you better think twice about that. So, but what provided an interesting sort of flashpoint for the novel is that our Congress, in its infinite wisdom, passed something in 2002 called the U.S. Service Members Protection Act, which literally provides the president with the authority to go and rescue any American soldier who is called to answer before a foreign court, and it's really aimed at the ICC. The people in Western Europe think this is preposterous and refer to this as the Hague Invasion Act. But because the United States has got this legal position, I thought to myself, so if the ICC is investigating American soldiers, there's inherent drama in that.
Well, I mean, of course, it's especially interesting now where that very important tension over the Servicemen's Protection Act and the U.S. Hostility to the ICC runs throughout the book and is a major part of the book. And
like the implied warranty of habitability.
Yeah, that's the real bit. That's what the fun part. But of course, this resonates because nationalism and fears of sovereignty. I mean, it's gotten to the point now where the president, yes, he is actually president, actually pulled out of a treaty in which all our obligations are purely voluntary and set by ourselves, and there was no one who could possibly hold us to account. And so, but he'll negotiate a better deal than that.
Right.
But anyway, sorry, that point is that idea of sovereignty and international justice is this very important theme in a really compelling, well-plotted story. And my question is that did you think, oh, the ICC is in fact an interesting setting, and this is an important tension, and what can I do with that? Or did you start to shape in your mind, the character Bill Ten Boom and the protagonist, and then start to think of it from there? What was a lot of novelists say, well, I come up with my character and then I proceed from there. What would they do? And the characters speak to me, sometimes they'll even say. And sometimes they'll say, I had this idea and then I wanted to see how it would work. How did that process work for you? How did the characters and the setting, the plot and this context emerge? Sort of what came first and how did it lead to the other? It's almost a mystery more than a thriller. So maybe we should just go right to the end. You could tell everybody, clear things up. But if we can work this through without giving too much away.
Well, I haven't gone back to really check, so I'm working on my memory of how this all fell together. The other thing I wanted to write about were the Roma, the gypsies, to be less politically correct. And that had been a bucket list item for even longer than writing about the ICC. When I was in law school, I had a relative who was dying very slowly in a hospital in Chicago. And I would visit him several times a week. And one day when I walked in, there was in every waiting room an encampment of people I quickly recognized as Romas, as gypsies. And after asking just a couple of questions from the very vexed and frustrated hospital staff, it turned out that the local person who we would refer to as the Gypsy King, who the Roma would call the Baro Rom, the big man, the clan leader, was sick and on the verge of death, and they were waiting vigil for him. And I came in one morning, and there were no Roma left in the waiting rooms. So this is 45 years ago, and you could still smoke in a hospital. And I noticed that not only were the Roma gone, but so were all of the ashtrays. And instead of having the sort of predictably bigoted response, I sat there and I said, these people live by values that I've got to try someday to understand. Because who doesn't know that someday, you or your children or other people you love and care about are going to get sick? And why would you engage in an act of petty theft, which everybody else would see as so likely to make you unwelcome in a place where you need to be hopefully well received? And that enigma always stayed with me. So I want to write about the ICC. Okay, here's my chance to write about the Roma. It's going to be a war crimes investigation. That's what they do at the ICC.
Related to the Bosnian War, by the way.
Right.
So.
And I got to Bosnia by accident. Then when I started to read about the ICC, I came upon the Service Members Protection Act, and I said, aha, where were American troops last in a combat role in a country that is a member of the ICC? So already I'm ginning around with my legal background, trying to cook up a circumstance where American soldiers credibly can be under investigation by the ICC. And that brought me to Bosnia, which Bosnia is a member of the ICC. I knew far, far less than I should have about the Bosnian War and the Balkan conflict in general. So, at that point, it's natural that I'm going to be writing about a prosecutor, because, prosecutors are, of course, also investigators. And the idea of writing about the character I called Bill Ten Boom was pretty natural to me. And some of it, I've been through lots of changes in my life in the last decade, and I gave my kids a space of time before I wanted to write about a character in that circumstance, but I was ready to do it. And so, and that's where Ten Boom came from. There is a kind of act of faith, though, in writing a novel. And there are certain elements in the book that just felt to me like they belonged there. Ten Boom's life has been thrown up for grabs. He, in the wake of his parents' death, he's first ended his marriage, then he's quit his law firm, and finally, as he says, he's willingly left his own country to go to The Hague. And there is a family secret, it turns out, that his parents have revealed to him. And I, as Ten Boom's creator, see this as what's driving him, even though he doesn't realize that. But the fact that that family secret had a relationship to what he was doing as a prosecutor is not something I was conscious of until I was probably 3/4 of the way through writing the book. And then I saw how, at least from my standpoint, how integral it all was and how it all fit together. And that's a very weird thing, and yet it's been my experience every time with every book that there's a part of my mind that knows what I'm writing about long before the rest of me does.
I mean, it doesn't surprise me that before you were able to really find success as a novelist, that you went to law school and you worked in other fields. There's the old saying, write what you know. And that's not just about external subject matter, that's knowing yourself and understanding human nature and human beings. And sometimes you just, some people are prodigies, others, most of us have to live for a while before we can really bring that to the page. And I think that's really wonderfully put, because, I jotted down some notes about some of these themes that come out, and one of them is divorce, character going through divorce. Another is more than one character. The divorce is a kind of a ongoing theme in the book, and people going through breakups of relationships. And also just unknowability, that you've got a U.S. prosecutor, U.S. lawyer who goes to work on this case at the ICC and begins the process of investigating. And of course, this isn't a new theme, and yet it is one of the most important and consistent literary themes, is unknowability. I mean, how when people tell you something, you don't know whether it's true. Someone else says something, how much of that is true? And here you are, you're saying that you yourself didn't know what you were writing. I mean, did you go back and sort of revise, or was that a theme that was just kind of naturally emerging because that's the nature of the beast as a lawyer? The kind of, where does the truth lie? How do we know what we know?
Well, the truth, first of all, this is always a theme in the mystery, always.
Yes.
How do we know what we are saying to each other is actually true? And, what is the concealed truth of life? And I am, I'm fundamentally Freudian in my outlook. I do believe that in the unconscious, and I think it has a significant role in the creative process. So that at least allows me to go along for a period of time with the feeling that sooner or later I'll figure out what the other part of my head is trying to tell me. And but it's a wonderful feeling when you finally figure out that all of this, 2 or 3 years' work actually has a kind of coherence to it that you were only sensing viscerally. So, but I think that you're asking these questions, though. I do want to kind of come back to you. Your commitment when you write a book is, I think, an even greater investment of time than the typical novelist makes. And how do you decide that you can live with, Cornelius Vanderbilt, for example, for all that time? How do you know it's going to reward your effort?
This is really unfair, turning the tables on me. I was going to ask about your own marriage experience, etc. Well, this is a interesting question because one great biographer who I was met at a book festival got this comment at a question: how the old saying is, if you're a biographer, you either fall in love with or you develop a total loathing of your subject. And she said she once wrote an essay on that question called "What's Love Got to Do with It?" Mm-hmm. And for me, the question is the person interesting? And in fiction, this is something Ian Forster wrote about in his actually 4 lectures, aspects of the novel.
Right, great book.
Yeah, but this is what's great. I'm sitting here with a lawyer who taught creative writing, so we can talk about this stuff not just from your experience, but you've been a professional student of creative writing. And he talks about how fiction can be truer than history, by which you can mean all nonfiction, because nonfiction deals in evidence. What is on the surface? If Queen Victoria did not say she was not amused, we would not know that she was not amused.
Right.
And that in fiction, we all know from our own experience, there's something below the surface, and fiction can take you there. And there's 2 interesting things about that. One is that, we're reading testimony, it's all first person. So in a way, we're put back in the situation of, we know Bill Ten Boom, but everyone else, it's like we can't go beneath the surface. We don't know. So it's I notice that similarity of what I deal with as a nonfiction writer. And yet, as a biographer, I am trying to create a real understanding of who this person is. So, if I don't know what's going on underneath the surface, I've got to point to the shapes and the motion of the surface. And sometimes I've got to be honest with the reader all the time, but I've got to try to understand this person. And what I'm looking for is depth and contradiction and all that three-dimensionality that makes someone real. And again, this is something that Forster talks about, the difference between a flat character and a round character. That a flat character you can describe, and they're always going to be true to that description. And a round character is capable of surprising you convincingly. And so in fiction, you can say, well, now this person's going to do that, and how am I going to make that believable? But in nonfiction, when I'm acting as a historian, it's nice to have people be nice and flat because you're getting to the essence of what's going on thematically. But in terms of creating a real believable human being, I've got to look for the ways in which they're contradicting themselves. And then that adds depth. That gives you a sense of what's going on beneath the surface. And so that complexity, I think, is really important. And again, like you made a choice to write about, from the first person. And that raises two interesting things. One is, like you said, unknowability and trying to get at the truth is such an important theme in mystery. And in fact, in law. I mean, law is about, prosecuting and defending, not necessarily a search for the truth.
Well, I always think, literally, the trial of a lawsuit is an exercise in history.
Yeah, presenting and criticizing evidence.
Right.
Yeah.
The lawyers are being historians. They are presenting their recreation of what happened in the past.
But it's also very interesting because you have a first-person narrator who's looking at the world. Obviously, everything outside himself is outside. But also you have, again, as you mentioned, the Roma. And I just wrote a book about someone who was immersed in, for important periods of his life, Native American history. Now, I am able to write about it from, I'm writing about him, but I have to present their story, and I'm an outsider. And I've got to do this respectfully, but also I have a responsibility to the truth. So I can't burnish and massage the facts to try to, so I don't look like I'm being insensitive. But also I've got to be sensitive. I've got to be respectful of the fact that I am an outsider presenting the story. I mean, was that, you've got fictional characters and you can have them be insensitive. It doesn't mean you as an author are insensitive. Can you just talk a little bit about that experience of writing about this much put upon group?
One of the characters says early on in testimony that you will meet the most progressive, tolerant people who will say without any self-consciousness, the dirty gypsies. And without question, the Roma are the most reviled minority group in Europe of today. And they're often seen as having brought that on themselves. And it is a culture that revels in not pleasing the majority. So that, the question that I asked 45 years ago about, how can they do this when they know they're going to get sick, has very complex answers, including the fact that in the Romani language there is only one tense, the present. And they do not have a collective history. They do not have their own creation myth. They do not have even an understanding of where they come from. It actually came from India, but you could probably still convince half the Roma in Europe that they're known as gypsies or Zignani or Gitano, because they were perceived as having come from Egypt, and that's where gypsy comes from. They don't at least until the current generation, they really weren't even aware that that was true. And the oppression has been legendary. They were slaves for 4 centuries in Romania. I had no idea. I had no idea. The persecution of the Roma, one of the characters says something that I knew as a Jewish person might offend other Jews, but there is no group of white people that have had the shit kicked out of them in the way that the Roma have. Even groups like the Jews and the Kurds, who have certainly had their hard times, it's been even worse for the Roma. They have largely been locked out of the educational system, so it's not surprising, of course, that there's a great deal of law-breaking behavior in that community. The Roma are the most imprisoned people in Europe. But I didn't want to present a kind of happy face picture of this group and say they've been oppressed horribly, ergo they are all angelic. They're not. They're not. They lie to the Gadya, that's the rest of us. They lie to us deliberately. They do not want us to know what is going on inside their community. So it is literally a cultural value not to tell the truth to any outsider. And I just, within the limits of my own knowledge, which really was based on a lot of reading, a lot of watching, and some visits to Roma villages in Bosnia, I wanted to be honest. I wanted to be honest to who the Roma are and who they have been.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting, the fact that, you really get a sense of here are a people who have been just ruthlessly oppressed, and their attitude is, look, we're not interested in, impressing you and in playing up to your expectations of the victim.
Right.
That we're going to take care of ourselves because that's what we've got to do to survive. I mean, that really emerges. And so as a result, there's a really gritty interaction where in the book, perfectly, liberally educated people have these really nasty attitudes towards the Roma, and you see the heat of that conflict.
Right. But I mean, just to emphasize how unique they are, I do not know of another minority group whose sense of identity is not founded on the oppressions of the past. Everybody who is proud to be an X can tell you when the X's were horribly mistreated. And that's part of a sense of identity of every ethnic group I'm familiar with, except the Roma. They don't even remember. Their ethos is it's not really good to dwell on misfortune. So they are truly remarkable.
Well, this is a good point. I'm going to be making a transition now. But the story really evolves with, again, a kind of real rich institutional sense of you've got the American military, you've got the American intelligence community is involved, you've got that community of The Hague, which emerges so vividly. And we're brought into that from this American character, Bill Ten Boom, who's actually coming home to where his family is from. And that takes, as he suggested, some interesting turns. And so it's a great, it's full of surprises. It's a great story, but again, it's rooted in, I think, that your curiosity about the world and about people, and also a moral sense. Which his one thing I didn't mention is your nonfiction book, Ultimate Punishment, about the death penalty, won the 2003 Robert F. Kennedy Center Book Award, the Robert F. Kennedy Center for Justice and Human Rights. I mean, these moral questions are clearly, even though you're out there writing just a really satisfying, gripping book, it's clear to me, and you can feel free to disagree, that these moral questions are important. And you know, we met because I went on the board of the Authors Guild. I think the year you became president, and we've gone on a couple of presidencies since then. The late Paul Aiken was executive director. Much missed.
Wonderful man.
One of the great human being and a great advocate.
A phenomenal advocate for American writers.
And that is what I saw when you're during your presidency, is this real knowledge and passion for the law and also for authors as well. So I just want to turn right now, before we start taking questions, and feel free to ask any questions you'd like, as long as they're questions and not lectures. But I want to talk a little bit about this whole question of this digital landscape we're in now, and the way in which there's multiple challenges facing authors today. And what happens is that positions get caricatured, and that how authors see the world. Like, I've been accused of being anti-library because I think, you know, it's good that people buy books. That's how I make a living. And I go out and I raise money for libraries constantly. So I love libraries. But the caricature easily comes in because there's so much conflict and there's ideology. And I just wanted you to talk a little bit about where you see the challenges for authors and for the creation of new speech, which is why we're passionate about copyright. It's about not just distributing the speech that already exists, but paving the way for more speech, for more creative work. And do you have any high point thoughts that you want to share on what the challenges are and what some of the issues are?
Well, I mean, nobody knows exactly how the copyright clause ended up in the Constitution. I think it's thought to have been under the influence of Daniel Webster, but it's pretty clear what the vision was, and there are only two professions that are mentioned by name, or three, I guess: authors, inventors, and farmers, in the Constitution. And the idea of preserving to authors for a limited period of time the right to exploit their work, to control its sale, is obviously based on a view that having an independent professional class of writers is good for the democracy. This is how we nurture complex expression, and that's what a book is, to feed the conversation within our culture and within our democracy. So, you know, that was one of the essentials on which literally the United States was founded. So we fast forward into the current environment, and the Authors Guild was founded because, you know, authors as a group are not terribly powerful, but
not terribly powerful. No, not at all powerful.
But you know, when the guild was founded, it was really a contest between authors and publishers, and but what has happened today is that the digital universe, glorious though it is, and we all know there are wonderful things about what has happened in the digital universe, including an immense expansion, both of knowledge and, even better, of access to it. But that world is controlled by massive capital. And we all think that Apple and Google and maybe Amazon are cool, and they are, because they're imaginative and they've done really innovative things. But we don't often focus on the fact that they are businesses and they exist to make money for their shareholders. And their job is not to be cool. The legal responsibility that they have is to make money for their shareholders. And all of these entities, whether we're talking about Amazon or Google, with whom the Authors Guild has had massive fights, have tried to enhance their position at the expense of authors. What am I talking about? I'll give one example. My youngest child, God save her, has decided to be a writer. And
I'm really sorry.
And she published a book some years ago. It was actually self-published. She was the one in 1,000 who has a great success with a self-published book. So she writes to me yesterday and finds that her book, which is available as an ebook for purchase on the Amazon platform and others, has been pirated, which is something that happens to all of us. And somebody, a site that is offshore, is offering it for free as a way to attract people to their site. It's a nice compliment to my daughter that her book has achieved that kind of popularity. But, and I took the moment to say to her, this is why you need to be a member of the Authors Guild. And that is because you can go to the people at Google and say to them, why in the world are you returning search results from a pirate site? And they will give you various arguments about free expression and how they don't want to police the internet, and you'll pardon me, bullshit. It's about their profits, and it's not about free expression. And as I said to her, look, this is just a wealth transfer from you to Google. That's all that's happened there.
I often say that the copyright clause, and people will come back and they'll say, oh yeah, but what about the Mickey Mouse Act that put on way too long of a term?
Sure.
Yeah, sure. But but that doesn't mean that it's all copyright is out the window. I mean, that's the point, is that you've got to be nuanced about these things and understand the whole point. And I often say it's the first freedom of speech clause in the Constitution, because there's many ways, and the fact that your daughter is self-published is a good example, where we've often talked at the Authors Guild that it's up to the author. If somebody wants to publish their book and distribute it for free with a Creative Commons license, great. I think that's terrific. Go ahead and do it.
I would totally defend every author's right to do that.
Yeah, but on the other hand, by being able to get income from my book by aggregating little bits of income from all of these individual purchasers, it frees me to write the way I want to write. If I have a patron, then the person who pays calls the tune, right? So we have 300 million people in America. If I can find enough, whatever the combination is out there to give me money back that helps me write, then I can write what I want to if I can find whatever mix of audiences. The aggregation means no one person has control. But when you rely entirely on patronage, when people get grants, I've gotten grants before, I think it's wonderful. But I don't want a system where that's the only way. I think free self-publishing is great, but I don't think that should be the only way. I need the help of the publisher with my type of book. And I think that's really important to point out. And, with these huge digital companies, is that what they're doing is they make their money by advertising. So when people share things, and I share, but when they share works that the author would normally, or musician or whatever would normally get income from that distribution, who's making money is the platform company. It's Google or whoever. They're selling advertising. So what they're doing is they're separating the act of creation from the returns from the creation. And they're taking all the returns. And then they're convincing the public that this is all about the right of users and that this is an attack on their freedom. Whereas really they're taking this position because it's about them aggregating all that income to themselves and taking it. And it's tough because, we are, individuals in a huge corporate economy. And the digital economy, which again has done great things, wonderful things, but these are the wealthiest corporations in the world.
Correct.
You look at the top 10 market companies by market capitalization, and they're filled with digital companies. Doesn't make them evil, but it means that they're huge financial interests, and that we're not only dealing with publishers as disaggregated individuals, but we're also dealing with these ones who hold the keys to distribution as well. It's a tough landscape.
And individual authors obviously have almost no leverage against. And again, I don't want to pick on Google, but the business model at Google is to use other people's content for free. That's what they're giving you when you get a search result. They're telling you what's in content that was created by other people. We litigated with Google. I still think we were right. I hope the issue revives itself. But we are not tilting at windmills. We are not Luddites. We are trying to protect the independent class of writers that was envisioned by literally a document as lofty as our Constitution. We are not advocating for government support of writers. We are not advocating for patronage. We are not advocating for university support of writers. All those things are good, and I am not against them. But best of all is what TJ was just saying, an independent class of writers who are free to read and think what they want and offer it to the reading public in the belief that that will enrich the cultural conversation, the society we have, and the democracy here.
Yeah, I think, and we're going to take questions now. If we could start getting the microphones set up for questions. But what I want to say is that, again, we were both trained academically, actually, in our fields, and I love and respect. I think the university is one of the great gifts of Western civilization to the world, or maybe it was formed in the East. I don't know who had the first university, and it's a great achievement of civilization. And I think that the fact that academics can pursue their interests, supported by a university system, that is really great, and that they have this professional discussion. But we need more than that. Now, your work takes on these important moral and pressing topical questions about the law and presents it in an entertaining way. And I'm sure more people are going to find out about the International Criminal Court and these tough questions of the Servicemen's Protection Act, et cetera, through your work than through 99% of the legal treatises that were published, all of which are great and necessary. I published a book on Cornelius Vanderbilt, one of the most important capitalists in world history. There had never been a biography, a serious, complete biography of one of the most important people in the creation of the capitalist world we live in today. And I took it on because I thought I could make money doing it. I was interesting, and I wanted to write a great book, and I wanted to say important things, but I thought I could support myself doing it. Now, that was kind of stupid of me. I say that it's the reason there hadn't been one before is no one hated themselves enough to take on the project. But after 7 years, I got it done, and it became the foundation of my career. And I did that because I wasn't shaped by the concerns of the academy, which are great, but I was thinking independently. I was outside of it. And so, again, we have this great mix. We want to preserve that mix. And so I'm the one who's talking. I'm sorry, instead of him. Why don't we start taking questions? And if not, then maybe I'll give some more of my own opinions. We have it right down here. We have one. Maybe, actually, should we set up? Is it a little easier if we set up a microphone? Or okay, go ahead. Bring it over here.
Hi. I was so interested in what you were saying because you're a great storyteller. And you were talking to us about how you went to Stanford and then you went to law school and what happened next.
What happened next was two things happened. I mentioned that I've had the implied warranty of habitability novel, and I'd been represented by a literary agent, and she was just a very crusty person. And I had a hard time communicating with her because as it was still the days of the 3-martini lunch. And as I like to say about the young writers at Stanford, they did not all write like Ernest Hemingway, but they certainly drank like Ernest Hemingway. So as a result, I was rarely up in time to catch her before she'd had lunch. And when I caught her after lunch, I couldn't understand a thing she was saying. So I wrote her this somewhat embarrassed letter saying that despite her really wonderful efforts on my part and the 23 different publishers to whom she'd schlepped my manuscript, that I was going to go to law school. And it just, as I'm writing this letter, because I don't want to tell her this on the phone, it just sounds more and more lame to me. And so I start saying in the letter, but you know, there's never been, at least I haven't read, a good nonfiction book that really goes through the daily life of a law student and how law school actually works. And I was not proposing that I would write that book. I was just tossing an idea out there. But
to make the letter sound better?
yeah, just to sort of sweeten the pot. Maybe she'd get distracted and stop swearing, a little bit sooner. And she went out to lunch with an editor, and it was a 3-martini lunch, and it began to rain in New York. And by 5 o'clock, after a couple of bottles of wine, they agreed there wasn't a good idea for a book anywhere in the city of New York. And then my agent remembered she had my letter in her purse. And the editor read the letter, and he bought the book on the spot.
Hold on, you wrote one L because you were embarrassed at telling your agent that you were...
So neither of them noticed that I was not actually proposing to write the book. Literally, a handwritten contract arrives in my mail. And to say that, I've had all these years of being unpublished as a novelist, and now I've got a book contract in my hand because I decided to go to law school. And it really was the great break of my literary career. And the only problem, of course, was that the editor was drunk when he bought the book. And so he called me up after I had written 1L and said, "You've got to remind me of just one thing." And I said, "Okay, well, what is that?" He says, "Why in the world did I want to buy this book?" And I went through the whole thing of selling him the book, telling him that there was this booming American interest in the law as a result of Watergate. It was pure hucksterism, even though most of what I said proved to be true. The fateful part of the story is that 1L, which came out in my third year in law school, that story I just told about why did I want to buy this book, is why 1L came out while I was still in law school, because I dare not wait, because he would forget again that why he wanted to publish the book. And for a first book, it was quite successful. And at that point, I made the decision that I was not going to go back to the writing life that had been so painful. Here I'd been a lawyer, a law student, rather. I'd managed to write while I was a law student, so I figured, okay, I'll be able to write while I'm a lawyer. And I became an assistant U.S. attorney in Chicago, a wonderful job, an incredibly demanding job. And so the only time I really could find where I was not overwrought by work or committed to it was the 30-minute ride on the morning commuter train. And but I tried to write every morning. This was what Wally Stegner had taught at Stanford, which is that it's really important that you try to write every day. It keeps the machinery greased. And it took a long time. It took 8 years to write Presumed Innocent that way. But, 10 years after 1L, Presumed Innocent came out, and every writer wants to say these words. It changed my life.
You had some big corruption cases, I understand.
Yeah, I loved being an assistant U.S. attorney, and that office was referred to as the conscience of Chicago. This may come as a shock to people who think that Chicago has no conscience at all, but they had used the federal mail fraud statute to really attack the democratic machine in Chicago and to begin to break up its hold over local institutions, including, in my last 4 years as an assistant, the state courts, which were notoriously corrupt. And I was of the view that, it's whether you can deter a young man who's, been beaten through most of his formative life from committing crimes that's a difficult question. But a position like a judge always seemed to me that if we could really send the message that taking bribes was going to result in horrible punishment, that we would clean up the courts in Chicago, and we did.
I didn't know there was corruption in Chicago.
Yeah,
it's
it's
interesting. Any other questions? Over here? Yeah, all the way over here. By the way, if anybody has had a book published, I encourage you to join the Authors Guild. It includes a free legal review of contracts, great website, set up your own website service, etc.
Well, first of all, I wanted to thank both of you gentlemen for providing a really stimulating capstone to what's been an amazing festival and has really elevated authors in our community to close to the position you deserve.
As I always say, I would not be here without all of you. And the same is true for TJ. So thank you all for coming and supporting this festival.
Well, and thank you, because I think I speak for all of us here that we're great fans, actually, of both of you. But my question is, as a fan of implied warranties myself, whether you have ever published the 4 books that didn't get picked up, and if not, is there any circumstance in which you would consider doing so we could see what the young man from Amherst and Stanford was like before he became Scott Turow?
I have gone back and read at least parts of those books. The truth is, as much as I could stand. And the book I wrote at Stanford was not bad. Everything that had preceded it was really embarrassing. And, it's just... I wrote a novel called The Laws of Our Fathers, and I stole about 15 pages from the Stanford book, and it was incorporated in my 4th novel, The Laws of Our Fathers. But there's a saying that every writer believes that his or her best book is the one that she or he is working on now. And so it seems unnatural to go back and try to fix something up or resurrect it. And the historical moment really, truly has passed. So I have resisted the very muted efforts that have been made to get me to publish the Stanford book.
Don't you find that those efforts, though, aren't wasted because you've got to actually try to work with language, or in the case of a novel, how do you construct a plot? How do you sketch characters? So I say every writer should write poetry, and then 99.99% of them should never show it to anyone.
Right.
but you learn to work with language by trying it.
Right. And, you know, there are very, very few Mozarts in the world of literature. You know, a dear friend and revered Bay Area writer, Amy Tan, had almost instant success. But she's really the exception. And for the most part, you need to learn to write. We live with the misconception that because we all use language every day, that writing is as natural as speaking. And of course it's not. The labor of figuring out how to attach words to thoughts and feelings requires a lot of practice. And you know, there are three keys to success in the arts, I think. But luck helps, talent helps, but so does persistence. And if you can't take a punch and get back up, there are very few arts in which you're going to end up making a career. So anyway, but those books failed for a reason.
We've got two questions right up here. Let's start over here, and then let's get you next.
At the time you were in law school, there was a major change in the way the courts of appeals operated. Court of Appeal opinions used to all be published, and everybody could use them. When you were in law school in the 70s, about 90% of the Court of Appeal opinions became what they call not to be published. And that wasn't so bad in the computer age because they're all online anyway today. But they have cognate rules which say you are prohibited from citing those rules,
right,
which is a killer. So I ask you both as an author, somebody interested in justice, and also as a trade association person, whether or not you folks might be interested in looking at either a factual story or a fiction story about enormous layers of judicial corruption which are fostered by this kind of system, and whether that would be a good attack to bring something otherwise not of much interest to the everyday citizen to his notice. Well, and there is a website called nonpublication.com which sets it forth in great detail.
I mean, there are all kinds of consequences of technology, and the fact that the personal computer literally made it easier to write opinions led to a tremendous proliferation in the number of opinions. Whether it is appropriate for courts of appeals, and they do this at both the state and federal levels, to say, well, we decided that case, but you can't use it as precedent, it rankles me. It rankles me too. But, you know, those courts make their own rules, and none of them have asked me. So. Yeah,
and then in terms of writing, you know, you see a structural problem or an issue, you really have to have a good narrative to really be able to write about it, unless you're a legal scholar writing about it. I mean, you're writing about the Cornelius Vanderbilt, the first tycoon. The most famous episode of his years when he became a railroad tycoon were the Erie War, where the fact that New York had their courts had jurisdiction over the entire state. So if you didn't like a decision, you just went to another New York Supreme Court judge and got him to issue an injunction against the other judge. And then once they all had injunction against each other, then you went out and did what you wanted to. So it's a bizarre legal story, but it's not worth writing about unless you have this epic case of financial corruption in that case. So, you know, it's difficult. I think you had a question right here.
Yeah, I'm wondering, Scott, what are you writing now in the climate of untruth that we have going on in our nation?
Somebody was asking me earlier today, and I mean, we all know this is an extraordinary time. And really and truly, you couldn't make it up because, you know, verisimilitude in fiction depends on understanding what the norms of behavior are and having your characters act in accord with them. And what is going on now, and you know, there's historical significance to this, and reasons for it as well. But the political norms that have governed in this country are obviously being thrown out the window, and you know, if I were to write about this, I would be writing about it in a much different context, about somebody of the kind of character that I assess our president to have. And but you know, I don't think you can, in fiction, you can't do it by way of a direct shot. And but there are days when I think that the most prescient novel about the current situation was Being There by Jerzy Kosinski, where a gardener becomes president of the United States.
Yeah, this is, let's take in one more question before we go outside and sign books. But this is really mind-boggling. I mean, the way in which, it's a moment in which, you know, like we were talking about issues that have been prevailing for authors about, you know, the new structure of the marketplace and the digital landscape. But now we're back to the old-fashioned question of free speech being about, is speech going to be banned? Trump really wants to imprison journalists, and he was talking seriously about, you know, limits on speech through reform of libel law, which fortunately is all in the States. But, you know, this is the first time in, you know, a generation at least that we've heard talking about the law being used on a wide scale against people doing investigative reporting, and as well as potential budget cuts to organizations that I use that preserve the record, National Archives and Library of Congress, and, you know, records not being saved, budget cuts being made. How do we keep government responsible to the public, and how do we know what's going on? All of that is being challenged in other ways. So we'll see what happens, but it's all the norms are up in the air.
Yes, thank you both very much. Wonderful discussion. You've been writing about law for a number of years. How do you think the law has changed, and has that affected your writing about the law? You're an observer of the law, you're immersed in it, you think about it. How has it changed since you wrote 1L, for example?
Well, it's changed in a number of ways. Basically, you know, I went to law school in 1975 in the lingering shadow of the Warren Court, and a lot of the path-breaking jurisprudence, particularly in the area in which I've spent my life as a lawyer in criminal justice, has slowly been erased. The law as an institution has grown more conservative, and that is because conservatives recognized long before liberals that if you people the court with a bunch of 40-year-olds, they will still be sitting there 40 years later. So there's been a general rightward drift in the law as a whole. And, you know, maybe the pendulum will swing back. The other thing that, you know, the 60s and early 70s seem to have given us was a stout commitment to the representation of the poor, including in civil matters. And again, that has been dramatically undercut in the ensuing decades. So I still believe in the law. I am fascinated by legal problems. I like lawyers, even though most Americans don't. And I still see the law as a noble enterprise. But I would be kidding myself if I didn't acknowledge that there has been some retrenchment in the ensuing decades. And, it's not universal, but generally speaking, it's a more conservative institution than it was when I entered it.
Well, thank you very much. We can... I just want to say that thank you all for attending the Bay Area Book Festival, which I don't think I mentioned at the outset, since we are taping this event. The Bay Area Book Festival is now in its third year, and it's just been a tremendous gift to the Bay Area and to especially those of us who live in the East Bay, and to be able to bring in authors like Scott Turow. And this is important, Turow is the correct pronunciation.
That is correct.
Yeah, a lot of people say Turow, so now you know it's Turow. You can correct them.
I always say Turow is the brand name. So
That's right. So again, thank you for coming to the Bay Area Book Festival. Books are on sale outside if you haven't gotten a copy. And we'll be outside signing. And if you have a last-second question, if you keep it brief, if the line's long, then please ask it then. Thank you.